Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for all those who are joining us from both around the UK, Ireland, and in other far-flung places. And thanks very much again for sort of making the time on a Friday night to join us and talk about a pretty important topic. And so the topic we're going to be dealing with tonight is specifically around violence against men and boys. We're going to focus primarily with a fantastic speaker we have tonight, Andrew Payne, who's going to talk to you about his experience to do with domestic violence, where he as a man was indeed the victim. And so just to introduce this topic, I want to just talk for a second about the narrative around domestic violence, intimate partner violence, that often focuses on men as perpetrators of violence and women as victims. But we obviously know that this is not always going to be the case. And it's becoming increasingly recognised that men can and they do experience violence from their female partners in domestic violence, and this includes domestic violence, which also can occur in gay relationships between men as well. But first off, I wanted to thank Andrew for joining us, and it's great to have you on board today, Andrew.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. No, looking forward to speaking to you. Excellent.
And look, I think we'll just jump right in. We've got a comment section there that people can post comments in social media. If you're tuning in via either YouTube or alternatively through Facebook, so feel free to make comments. We will have people monitoring those, and we're hoping that we can also make this a little bit interactive as well, and actually try and respond to some of those comments throughout the presentation tonight. I guess first off, Andrew, what I wanted to do is just to ask you to sort of outline your own personal experience with domestic violence for those who haven't had a chance to see your TED Talks or your various other talks.
Sure. I mean, I experienced domestic violence in my first marriage from 1999 to 2008, towards the end of 2008 when it was absolutely done. So it's about over a 9-year period. The violence wasn't every day, it wasn't every week, but it was certainly every month, every other month, and it could get quite out of control. So I bit, biting, punching, scratching. I've been stabbed, heavy things thrown at me, often sort of leaving me bruised, cuts on faces and things like that. And I often used to laugh actually that when I was employed early on in my marriage, I'd constantly come to work with sort of cuts and scratches on my face and bruises, and people would be like, what's happened to your face? And I'd be like, shaving, yeah. And back then in sort of 99 to 2000, people weren't, I don't think there was the awareness that perhaps there is today. So it seemed to be that people accepted this excuse time after time. And I did sometimes wonder, surely somebody is going to think, blimey, this guy needs some attention with his shaving because he is calamitous. But so it was a mixture of violence. And to be clear, the abusive relationship that I was in, there was a whole lot of other stuff that went with that. Emotional abuse, gaslighting, humiliation. And I think that's quite common where people are in violent relationships, that the violence is just part of a bigger thing going on.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate what you're saying there in terms of that, and some of those sort of what I guess you refer to as those mechanisms of control that perpetuate that violence. I guess in talking to that as well, we're covering off on a number of different topics throughout the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We're talking obviously about gender-based violence in terms of violence against women. We'll be talking about sexual violence. Obviously, we're talking tonight about violence against men and boys. There are other types of violence which we talk about as well in terms of financial violence and so on and so forth. Yeah. But I guess it's useful if it's possible, if we could just tease out just a little bit, just some of those experiences that you may have had, and just we'll try and classify them as such. This is purely pedagogical for the purposes of people to understand how this can come about. Sure.
I mean, I think some of the common misconceptions that I face. So sometimes people will say, well, you're a bloke. You could have just walked out the door, or why didn't you just hit her back once? That might have solved the problem. And I mean, I'm not a violent man, but there was a time towards the end of our relationship where the thought crossed my mind, if she comes for me again, do I or don't I hit her back? And I think the dilemma I faced at the time, number one, I don't want to hit another person, particularly a woman, and I was brought up to believe that you don't do that. But also there's wider implications. You know, if I hit my wife, then of course on the school run, when she sports her black eye and tells everybody that her husband's been hitting her, then there are implications to that. What am I going to say to my daughter? So hitting back was never an option for me. It wasn't in me. But also when it did cross my mind that there are some horrible dilemmas, and those dilemmas affect also why you don't walk away. And if I walk out the door, I'm leaving my children in the hands of an abusive person. You know, no loving father will do that. A loving father will lay his life down for his children. If I walk out the door, then if I want to continue having contact with my daughters, then there's a risk, you know, because this is an abusive person, and now that she's no longer being violent towards me, maybe this game will shift into psychological warfare, and she's going to control my contact with my daughters. And, you know, I was used to living with my daughters on a daily basis. I loved my daughters dearly. You know, I don't want to put myself in a situation where I might not see them anymore. And so these are some of the fears that will play on a man's mind when he's weighing up, do I stay or do I leave? And also, who's going to believe me? You know, I've not reported this violence so far. My wife was very articulate. She knew how to play the system. So there's all kinds of stuff that makes leaving very complicated for men and for women, frankly. And so I think, like I say, there are people that will just be like, well, surely only a wimp would allow themselves to be the subject to violence from their intimate female partner. But listen, you know, a good friend of mine actually, after my TED talk, got in contact with me. I hadn't seen him for a while, and he's 6'5", and he's built like a tank, let me tell you. And he is a formidable character emotionally. He owns his own legal practice, and he was brought to the brink of suicide due to the sheer level of abuse over a period of time that he suffered at the hands of his female partner. So I guess what I want to say today is anybody can find themselves in an abusive situation. It doesn't mean you're weak or stupid. Any woman or man can find themselves in that situation. It could happen to anyone from all walks of life, even people that look really big and tall and maybe their partner isn't so big. It can happen. And so it is complicated there. And I guess that's what I'd want to share today. And I do think that the stigma for men of accepting that actually I'm being knocked about by my female partner, there is a stigma attached to that. We feel like we should man up. We feel like we should be in control. We feel like we should be leading the home. And so what kind of man allows himself to be beaten up by his wife? That kind of stuff will go through your mind if you're in it.
Yeah, and it's interesting you draw out the concept of that social stigma around violence against men, where men are indeed victims to the violence. And I guess that sort of leads me to a question about what would be your opinion about the reporting of this type of violence and the capturing of data around that? Do you think that stigma plays a part in perhaps the willingness for people to report, in addition to obviously the challenges they have in terms of actually responding to it within their relationship?
I think so. I mean, with the data that we have in the UK to this point, it would appear that a third of victims of domestic abuse are men, and that obviously includes violence and other forms of abuse with an intimate relationship. But you know, it is generally accepted that there's a huge amount of underreporting. And in my own small world, since doing the TED talk, I think as I was saying to you before doing this show, so many women have contacted me saying it happened to their brother, their son, their partner. He didn't report it at the time, but was left in a really bad way. And so it will be interesting to see how the stats unfold in the years ahead, because I do think awareness is growing. You see police forces now in the UK running campaigns on domestic abuse, but very much running either gender neutral campaigns, or they're running campaigns where the woman is the victim and also the men are the victims too. They're trying to get that message out there. And so I do think there's a huge amount of underreporting. We don't know the extent of that. We don't know the impact truly of domestic abuse on these suicide figures. So what we do know is that generally domestic abuse and then issues in the family courts will go hand in hand as the dynamic of the relationship changes when it breaks down. And we do know that when men don't see their children for a long, long time and they can't get access to them and the family courts are expensive and they're painful and they're stressful, that there is a link with suicide. But to what extent, what's the data saying? And more needs to be done on that to be clear. But in answer to your question, I do believe there's a huge amount of underreporting, but I do think it's changing. The more that we're talking more openly about mental health, encouraging men and women to speak out about what they're suffering and what they're struggling with. And I think that's a really good thing. And I think it will change the data, I think, over the next sort of 5 to 10 years as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also would reiterate for people who are listening as well that clearly when we're drawing out these issues and we're talking about Andrew's lived experience and working through some of these really sort of quite difficult points to talk about here, this doesn't take away from the fact that that clearly women can also be victims of both intimate partner violence and broader sexual abuse.
And we need to be clear, and this is where I think language can be misleading. The fact is, with the data that we have, the greater proportion of victims of domestic violence are women. Let's be clear about that. I think where there are groups that will say the overwhelming majority are women, I don't think the stats back that up. It's a third to 2/3 as we have it. But let's be clear, the greater proportion are women. And, you know, I have personally, I have female friends who have suffered horrendously. So, you know, my passion as a man, having been in an abusive situation myself, is, you know, we need to do more to diffuse the gender tension. So there isn't this kind of competition about, well, what about me? What about, you know, what about us? And we have it worse than you. And men suffer more than women or less than women. You know, the fact is men and women abuse and men and women suffer within that abuse. And I feel that there is a lot of gender tension out there. And I hope that we can diffuse that moving forward.
Yeah, you talk in your TED talk about this being a human issue. So you identify this sort of intimate partner violence as really being an issue that impacts both men, women, and obviously in a relationship would also impact any children that would be involved as a sort of a human issue.
And don't forget with domestic abuse, with the wider picture of domestic abuse, you also have, and I know I've read about this, and police forces reporting this, as widely increasing instances of children abusing parents. And so actually, when we talk about domestic abuse, we need to cover the whole picture, because I know, you know, I'm a parent, and if my child was being violent towards me and abusing me, I would feel like I was a rubbish parent. I would want to hide that. I wouldn't be open about that. Yet it would be hugely detrimental to my mental health. I'd be struggling with it, I'm sure. And so, you know, we need to be talking, when we talk about domestic violence, we need to remember the different faces of that. And like you mentioned earlier, as we started, you know, there's domestic violence, man to man, woman to woman, man to woman, woman to man, sibling abuse, children abusing parents. It's all domestic abuse. And we need to cover that. We need to remember that. And we need to be clear about that in our language about domestic abuse.
Absolutely. And I think what you're talking about there is really about having a gender perspective and applying a gender perspective to understanding what the data, what's actually out there, and obviously also being able to work through the consequences and implications for that. Look, I want to draw out some more points specifically about your own lived experience, if I can. We've had a question come in, and that question is about whether close family members or mutual friends learnt about or knew about the abuse that you were suffering, and if they did they take you seriously, or did they find that because you're a man, they sort of were able to minimise those impacts and look to you to say, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think in my situation, and I think my situation is common, and I think it's a warning sign if you, for you to, you know, in terms of looking out for others, in the abusers will generally try and isolate we call them a victim just for now, just for a matter of ease, they'll try and isolate their victim from close family and friends, and they'll work at it over time. They're not stupid. This is not a relationship you can break down quickly. You have to break it down gradually and manipulate, and abusers are very good at that. And so really I became quite isolated from my parents. By the time it was really, really, I was in a bad way. You know, I was living in France, and the rest of my family were in England. I'm an English guy, and my friends are in England, and abuse is very good at that. And the chaos that used to occur in my house, the thought of my parents coming to visit, although they're really fairly easygoing, meant that I just reduced the kind. It just wasn't worth it, because when you're a victim of abuse, your entire outlook is about minimizing the risk of your abuser's triggers being pulled. You will do whatever it takes. You will compromise your integrity. You'll lie. You'll do whatever it takes. Your life is about minimizing those triggers. And so, because my wife used to make it so difficult in the run up and afterwards to my parents coming to stay or my sisters coming to stay, I just didn't go there. And so my family knew that there were problems. In talking to them, since they weren't sure, they didn't realize quite the scale of the violence that was going on. They definitely did believe it, and my friends believed it, but there have been other people that haven't, and generally it's because they haven't heard my side of the situation, or they've only heard what my ex-wife has had to say. I generally have been believed when I've reported it to sort of authorities since, and discussing it openly with social services, from what I can tell, because after the relationship, there are all kinds of issues in the family courts. And I didn't go out there saying I was the victim of domestic abuse, but when officials started to work really closely with me and my daughters and trying to get to the bottom of what was going on, I did find I was taken seriously. But that's not always the case, and I do have contact with plenty of men where they are not taken seriously and they're not believed. But I think that's changing. I really do think that's changing.
And in your case, did you even yourself realize that what you were suffering or what you were being subjected to was indeed domestic abuse? And if you didn't, then how did that realization come about? What was that tipping point for that?
Well, I mean, I don't think I'm stupid, but it sounds fairly bonkers that, you know, if you experience regular violence, you are being controlled, you're being isolated from friends and family and all that kind of stuff. Well, surely you would know that it's domestic abuse, but I really didn't. Abusers are very good at making you doubt your own sanity, and so I genuinely believed that it was all my fault. I genuinely believed that because I was such an idiot, I was just constantly provoking my ex-wife, and if I was a bit cleverer and if I was more of a man, then she wouldn't keep getting so mad. And so I genuinely believed it was my fault. I did not see it as domestic abuse. I mean, I even went to counseling to try and become this kind of better person that wouldn't provoke my wife. And so how can you escape domestic abuse if you don't even recognize it as domestic abuse? And if you think it's always your fault, well, you're not going to be looking for a way out. You're just going to be looking to become a better person.
And so ultimately then what is in the end result? How do you then come out of that sort of toxic environment? What is that tipping point, and when did you actually come to realize it?
Yeah, I had a wake up call. My wife attacked me and stabbed me with a pencil. And at the time, we were living in France, and it was the kind of lovely little French village where we just used to walk in and out of each other's houses. You know, people didn't lock their doors. And there were some expat Brit people on our street. And my ex-wife, should I say, was very good friends with our neighbor. And our neighbor heard my wife screaming at me, and could just hear it was getting bad, and sort of burst through the front door as my wife was stabbing me in the arm with a pencil. And so my neighbor sort of took my wife off and tried to sort of calm her down and whatever. And then later that evening, my neighbor said, Andrew, she's very well spoken. She said, you do realize this is domestic abuse. And I remember thinking, is it? Oh, what's she talking about? And then I kind of reflected on it. And definitely for me, it did start a train of thought that actually this isn't right. Maybe it's not all my fault. And then the relationship split, you know, was another year after that. But that was the wake up call where someone actually very gently challenged me and said, I've seen it. It's domestic abuse. Come on, you know. And right. That was a wake up call. Had I not had that wake up call, who knows? Maybe I'd still be there today.
Yep. And so sort of all of those sort of that grooming process and sort of those early warning, early triggers, they were sort of it didn't really hit home for you until such time as somebody else external and with an objective, perhaps an objective perspective, was able to offer that to you and point that out.
No, definitely. And maybe if my parents had said that, I knew my parents didn't like my ex-wife. I mean, hey, listen, I wouldn't like a partner of my kid if I suspected that they were really horrible to my kid, you know, obviously. But I think the neighbor was a very good friend of my ex-wife. So for her to say that to me, I really did think, wow, actually, maybe I really, really do need to look at this. And, you know, early on in the relationship, some people think, well, if you like, only someone stupid is going to get stuck in an abusive relationship, surely. And I think there's two ways into an abusive relationship. I think sometimes people are conned. So you get together with someone, they're absolutely lovely, you fall in love with them, really the relationship develops, and then that other person, you know, maybe it's after the wedding day. I know a female friend of mine that happened to her, literally like on a honeymoon, it all went to pot. This guy changed overnight. So people are conned. But there's another way into abusive relationships, I think, and I think this was me, where you get people that want to help. And that was me. I was a nice person. I wanted to help, but I didn't have good, strong boundaries. And so people that want to help and don't have strong boundaries, they are very vulnerable to falling into abusive relationships. And so I knew early on that my wife, well, she wasn't my wife at the time that I first knew her, obviously, but I knew early on that my girlfriend was difficult. There were problems, but I wanted to help her. I wanted to make her better. And I felt that if I loved her enough, I could change her, you know, I could stop the violence. And I do think that's the other way into abusive relationships. And suddenly you're in too deep. And then you think it's all your fault, and you're trapped.
Yeah, and we talked about stigma and shame, and particularly that stigma and shame around sort of the masculinity aspect of what it means to be a man, and how people might perceive you as a potentially as a victim of domestic abuse, and whether they're going to believe you, but also as well just in terms of your stigma and shame around actually going ahead and making reports of it. How did you sort of overcome that stigma or shame that exists in a societal aspect in your individual circumstances?
Well, I suppose I didn't, because at the time I just didn't feel I could report it. I didn't feel that I would be believed, particularly by the authorities. And I kept very quiet about it. In fact, you know, I only really started talking about what I'd been through, you know, many, many years later. And so I do think that, you know, we're brought up as men to, you know, we should be strong. We should be, you know, we should be able to handle ourselves. We should be able to, you know, yeah. So I'm struggling to find the words really, but I think the whole sense of manning up and don't be a girl's blouse, and who wears the trousers, and needing a kitchen pass to go out. These kind of things that you hear these comments all the time. You know, I play a lot of football, and so you hear them in the changing rooms and the banter, but actually, although there is banter, and on the one hand it's harmless, on the other hand it kind of sets up this it does set up a stigma where we don't help ourselves. Now, part of my passion now is trying to undo those stigmas so that actually it is okay to talk about this stuff. And you know, big girls blouse, that kind of language doesn't help. That kind of it doesn't help.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I think it exists on a spectrum as well. You know, we grow up perhaps as young boys being told that you know, boys don't cry, that boys pick themselves up and dust themselves off on the sporting field. Perhaps it's you know, that men are seen to be the strong ones, that without being a strong character and having sort of that intestinal fortitude to be able to push through things, that you'll never be attractive to a woman. They'll never want something that's not a strong man. And I guess those societal aspects about what it means to be a man, and that aspect of masculinity, you're told on one hand to be a gentleman, but then in many respects there, perhaps in your caught in a situation like yours, there is that stigma and shame then does pile on to that from your perspective.
I think that's absolutely right. You know, I was talking to a guy who was he does training around suicide prevention, and I was asking him, you know, because I've got 3 boys under 7 now, and I was saying, what can I do to, you know, I worry about these things, and, you know, and he told me this thing he does with his boys. And I now do it with my boys, where before they go to bed at night, they share something with me every day. We do it every day. And after we've been on this, after I've done this show, that's where I'm going, because they'll be waiting for me. They share something that made them feel happy that day, and they share something that made them feel sad that day. And they look forward to sharing both things, and they can always find something. And I think it is just so important that we get our boys learning to just be able to share, if they want to, something that maybe makes them feel sad, so they know it's not bad to express that you're feeling sad about something, whatever that is.
Yeah. And I think, again, we talk about that existing on that spectrum of really being in touch with what it is to really have a sense of yourself, I suppose. And you know, we've touched upon a number of issues here to do with the stigma related to violence against men. We've talked now about it being a human issue, and about the fact that that men can be both perpetrators of violence, but also obviously victims of violence. I guess I really wanted to try and draw out for you here about what sort of advice would you give any men out there who may be experiencing violence themselves, or this may be a wake-up call to them to think to themselves, gee, perhaps something's not right in the relationship I'm in, or perhaps something's not right with my mate in the relationship that they're in, and what can they really do about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 separate things there, really. I guess if it's you and you're caught in it, it is really hard to see beyond it when you're in it, because, as I alluded to earlier in this, that when you're in it, so much of your life is spent trying to minimize the risk of triggers being pulled. I mean, I became an obsessive planner. Every day I'm thinking through what could set her off, and what do I therefore need to do to stop that from happening. And so to have the spare headspace to then think about, well, should I be putting up with this? What are my options? You just get stuck into just everyday survival, I suppose. But to anyone watching this who might feel that they're in an abusive relationship, it is so important to try and talk to someone outside that relationship, someone that you can trust. The problem, if you talk to an abusive person or a narcissist that you are struggling within the relationship about certain things they do, is they're never going to accept responsibility. They're going to always make you think it's your fault. And so the important thing is that you talk to someone outside the relationship and just share what you're going through with someone that you trust. And so I know it's so obvious and simple, but you really talk to someone else. And you know, then you may have things that you need to think about. You know, if you've got children, it may be that if you're thinking, well, actually, I do need to leave, that some planning needs to take place first in terms of how you do that safely for yourself and for your children, legally what your options are. And it may be that you need to do a little bit of homework first, but do that homework and keep talking to the person outside the relationship who can be your confidant and help you to see reality, because abusive people are so good at making you think it's your fault and you've not read it properly, and actually it's all down to you. So that's the first thing, if you're in it, I think. And I would also say that there are more and more men's groups out there that will just offer really easygoing support. There's obviously Mankind Initiative, who are a domestic abuse support group for men, but there are other groups, other individuals as well. You jump on Twitter and use the hashtag domestic abuse, start finding the men's groups. There are some really reasonable men's groups out there that are not really angry men's groups, but they're really constructive. If you think that somebody else is in domestic abuse, it's a difficult one, because I think that the victims of domestic abuse, when they're in it, they are their abuser's greatest defenders, and they will defend to the hilt. Oh yeah, but you know, she had a difficult upbringing, or you know, she's changed. You know, she's doing her best. We're in counselling, or no, it's not like that, mate, at all. And so we make these excuses. We cover it up, partly shame, partly because we just wish the situation was better. So it is difficult, but truly, I think if you suspect someone else is in abuse, I think it is helpful to say, listen, I'm worried about you. I'm here for you. Anytime you want to talk, I will keep your confidence. Anytime you want to bounce something off me, just know I'm here. That's all you really can do.
Yeah, I guess in that case there as well, a lot of the great advice and the tips you've given there are probably just as appropriate for someone who's a woman in a sort of a violent relationship as well, as much as it is a man. I guess in that respect, is there anything that is specific around a man being the victim in a domestic partnership or a domestic relationship where they're the victim of violence? That anything else we can draw out there? Anything in particular? That perhaps to overcome some of those stigmas we talked about earlier, that perhaps society should be doing to deal with this?
I think, so just rephrase the question, any advice for what men caught in abuse?
Well, any advice that specifically relates to men. So, a lot of that advice is great advice and is great general advice and would apply as equally to women as it would be to men. Is there anything further specific that we could look at in terms of men experiencing violence, in the home, for example?
Yeah, I think when men get to when I got to the point of leaving, something had changed in me, and it had been changing for a while, and I'd become increasingly to the point of just not putting up with this, taking this any longer. And I think my encouragement to men, because I think for me, I suffered for years in abuse, and I was able to walk away from that relationship without having lashed out back at my ex-wife, which is great. I'm glad that I was able to do that. And I was able to generally walk away in a way where then my communication with my ex-wife was very careful and considered, which is difficult when you walk away in that moment, you're feeling raw, you're feeling angry, but you can make some bad decisions in those moments that will come back and bite you on the nose in the family courts. And so that's why when I say about trying to, if you feel that you're in abuse, maybe you need to be thinking and planning about how you leave before just walking out. There's things you need to think through. It's not that you shouldn't leave, it's just that you need to have things in place, the legal side of things, some kind of where you're going to live, financially, how it's going to work. Those kind of things you need to thought through. But it is so important for men, particularly, that we are really squeaky clean in our communication with our partners, because particularly if we have children and we will then be being dragged back to the family courts and whatever for contact, everything from the texts we send to the emails to the conversations, even if we're raw and hurting, we need to try to be polite and constructive. And I have seen guys where they've been bruised and really hurt over the years, and then when they leave, they're quite angry about what they've been through, and then they're emailing and their texting is becoming angry. That isn't going to help them in the family courts. And some of the stuff I do is trying to tone guys down a little bit, so that because what they will most want is contact with their children after that relationship breaks down.
And it's really, I guess that sort of takes me to my next question, which is really about sort of the impact on children. And I wonder if you might be able to share with us some of your own experiences for how your children responded to sort of a situation that you were in, and perhaps from the dark days to where you are now, and for those as well to draw out this idea that perhaps how people can learn from bouncing back, how they can learn to bounce back as a result of these impacts.
I mean, they didn't fare great from what they saw. The impact of seeing the violence, the rows, the disrespect. And I used, it was one of those ones where, and this was part of my rationale for leaving, was, I always felt I should stay there for the good of the children. I needed to stay in the relationship. And I sometimes hear that. But then the thing I was thinking about, but if my daughters grow up and go through their teens seeing this massively dysfunctional, abusive relationship as the norm, well, that doesn't help them either. And so I took the decision that it's better that they see less of me, but at least I'm repaired. And hopefully if I find love again, I'm in a healthy relationship, which thankfully I am now. It's better that that happens and we go through the pain of divorce and relationship breakdown, all that stuff, than I stay in this kind of horrible relationship. And so the leaving was really, really hard. And it wasn't helped by the fact that, you see, no divorce is easy. But when one side is abusive and wants to just, they love the drama. You know, once I remember, I'll give you an example. So I remember dropping my daughters back. They were young girls. And my now ex-wife was on her knees on the doorstep, begging for me to go back and pick them, pick the family. And I'm just trying to drop the daughters back in contact. And my daughters were now crying and she was crying. And she was very good at like, you know, the kind of the histrionics and the drama. But that kind of stuff really tugs on you, you know, what, am I making the right decision? And look, my daughter, you know, they were happy. Now they're really, really sad and it's all my fault. And those kind of games will be going on, and it's really, really hard. And it's hard to see your children going through that. But it is best for your children that they see you repaired and in a healthy relationship. And so I liken it to the, you know, you say there's that phrase that the grass is greener on the other side of the hill. Well, I think it is for people coming out of abusive relationships. But first of all, before they get to those green pastures where the sun's shining, they have to crawl through the crap. And there's a lot of it, and it hurts and it's tiring and it's painful, but it is worth that crawling. For everybody's sake, it's worth that crawling. But listen, my daughters, it's been difficult. The family court stuff's been really, really stressful, and that dragged on for a long time. But I do think that, you know, that shouldn't be a reason why you stay in abuse, because you can get through these things and come out on the other side. And there is hope. You know, I went to the family courts. I've had good experiences and bad experiences at the family courts, but ultimately my daughters were moved to my custody. I have rebuilt. I'm happily remarried. I've got 3 young boys under 7. You can repair, but when you're going through it, it feels like you'll never get back on your feet. And that just isn't true. You just got to try and hang in there and connect with maybe people that have been through it. And like I say, for men particularly, there are more and more groups popping up that will support you. You're not alone.
And I guess in many respects here, there may be people who are out there at the moment who hopefully will have had their eyes opened to some of the unique and gendered aspects to do with gender-based violence when it comes to violence against men from our talk tonight, Andrew. And you know, I think that this is a fantastic way to sort of advocate for these issues and to sort of bring them to light. I guess one thing I would be interested to know is, as a result of you speaking out, as a result of you being involved in the public forum and giving a TED talk and other talks that you've given, have you experienced any blowback from that? Do you think that people view you differently? How have people that have been around you, either as family, friends, or acquaintances or work colleagues, reacted to your story?
Actually, close family and friends, although the violence was more extreme than they thought at the time, they're not surprised. They knew it was tough. Apparently, so when I moved back from France to England, apparently I was known in France as St. Andrew because of the crap that I used to deal with my ex-wife, although no one knew about the violence, but they could see, you know, when we were out at parties and stuff, the kind of the verbal abuse and the kind of the bullying that was taking place. So I don't think anyone was particularly surprised by the TED talk itself. I think in terms of blowback, you know, there's been very little negativity. There's been I could count on one hand the amount of people that come back and said, well, we haven't heard her side of the story. And it's like, well, you haven't, because it's a TEDx talk, and that'd be a very odd TEDx talk. It was me on one side of the stage and her on the other side of the stage. And it's a fair point to make. You've only got my side of the story, but I wonder, you know, there's plenty of women giving TEDx stories and on the TEDx platform. And I would hope you'd ask the same question of them, so that you're consistent. I hope you're not just asking that of me because it's a bloke going on about domestic abuse. But generally, the feedback's been hugely positive. as I mentioned earlier on this show, the amount of women that have come back to me saying that it happened to their brother, son, uncle, partner. I've had a lot of men contacting me, some saying they're in abuse, they don't know what to do. Most part, it's men. When men get in contact with me, it seems to be that they've come out of abuse, and often they're stuck in the family court situation. So there has been a lot of comments, a lot of people coming back, and I'm delighted actually that I'm now involved in piloting, co-leading a pilot project for domestic abuse, victims of domestic abuse. I'm about to get more involved in the general men's mental health space next year with some sort of talking groups. I really want to push that forward because it's so important, and that remit goes beyond domestic abuse.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that one of the great things about tonight is the idea behind why we were specifically talking about or really asking you to share your story tonight with us, Andrew, was because we wanted to, in this discussion of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, really highlight that violence also occurs against men and against men and boys in this case. So I guess the purpose of us sharing your story with us is indeed so that people do become exposed to.
And I think yeah. And I think, with men, it is really serious. There are men who have been on the brink of suicide or who have actually killed themselves. And someone asked me, well, did suicide ever cross your mind? And it really didn't. I don't even know why that wasn't a factor for me. I think probably having daughters helped, having a loving family helped. So rebuilding was I had a mum and a dad who were happy to open up their home to me and have me there rent free, and I've been really blessed by that. But it is a shocking really that if a third of victims of domestic abuse in the UK are men, but less than 1% of refuge places are actually reserved for men, there is more that needs to be done. We do need to deliver more funding into men's services, because to say, well, men don't suffer as much as women, that is just not the case. Women and men suffer, and for me, I didn't, my personal safety wasn't at risk after the relationship, but within the relationship there were plenty of cases where my personal safety was indeed at risk. My ex-wife drove us off the road once when she was driving in the middle of a row, veering across the other side of the road and into a ditch. And like I say, I've been stabbed, all that kind of stuff, threatened with knives quite regularly. And so I do think that's the other thing, is that it would appear that women are more at danger physically after they've left. And that's where you see women sadly becoming victims of homicide. For men, where men are the victims of homicide, it tends to happen within the relationship. So let's not just suppose that men maybe suffer domestic abuse, but it's not as bad as women. I mean, it's not a competition anyway, but let's take domestic abuse against men seriously. The impact is serious and long lasting. And from a lot of the stories coming to me this year, men who've gone through it are really, really struggling to work through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're really getting at here is that any discussion around gender-based violence has to be nuanced, and it has to be nuanced with the detail where we apply a gender perspective, where we understand those societal pressures, where we understand societal stigmas, where we understand how that impacts both men, women, boys, and girls in a discussion around gender-based violence, and particularly when we're talking about, say, sexual violence or indeed physical violence. And so that's really fantastic that you've been so willing and so open to sort of share your story, Andrew, tonight. And I'd really like to thank you for that. I guess in closing, I wanted to first of all just ask, how could people get in contact with you, Andrew, if people are out there listening tonight and they think, you know what, I really just need to talk about this, and perhaps they see you as being a guiding light in this aspect. How could they contact you?
Well, as you've probably seen on my name is Andrew Payne, P-A-I-N. Most Paynes are not spelt like that. And with my initial A, you do have to wonder what my parents were thinking about. So I'm not difficult to find. There's not too many Andrew Payne spelt like that. So LinkedIn, Twitter, I've got a website, but if you go to the website, you'll notice it tends to be more around my leadership coaching work. But listen, I'm talking regularly with people going through it. You know, if you want to get in contact, bounce something off me, then do that. I'll happily have the conversation. I want to help as much as I can. So either go to www.andrewpayne.co.uk, but to be honest, just find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, connect with me. And if it's helpful for us to have a conversation, then I'll happily give some time to do that. Yeah.
That's fantastic, Andrew. And you know, again, thank you so much for being so open and so willing to talk about what is really a difficult subject, but also a subject that perhaps doesn't receive as much attention as others. Again, it's not a competition here, and we fully acknowledge at WHIS, we fully acknowledge that that gender-based violence occurs against men, women, boys, and girls. And the purpose of tonight's discussion has really been about trying to highlight how for men in intimate relationships, in domestic relationships, they can be the victims of such violence. We will be doing other talks throughout this 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We will be talking about the role of civil society and NGOs within the GBV space. We'll be talking about health responses. We'll be talking specifically about intimate partner violence and focusing there on intimate partner violence against women. We'll be looking at the role of men and boys as advocates for gender equality. We'll be looking at issues to do with education, financial violence, human trafficking and modern slavery, female genital mutilation, women working in healthcare, and also to do with issues to do with policing and human rights and gender-based violence aspects of policing. So that's sort of some of the other presentations you can look forward to coming up throughout these 16 days of activism. So I guess from that perspective here, for those who have tuned in tonight, certainly don't walk away from this thinking that that WHIS doesn't acknowledge that the gender-based violence exists across the spectrum. But obviously, again, thank you, Andrew, for sharing your experience as a man who's experienced gender-based violence.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys.
Cheers. Thank you.